Yeah, really good to be here, really good to be talking about the circular economy. And I'm talking about it in terms of the different stages of design. And I hope I'll be picking up on some of the observations that have been coming out the question times that we've had so far. So really good session just gone. So we've had quite a lot of chat today about why circular economy matters. And Emily, Claire and Sean are still to come, and they'll be talking about how to do this, how to go about this on a project level. So my focus in this session will be not so much about the why or the how, but the bit in between. So really this is me talking to you about how to convince our clients, our stakeholders that it is important. So moving the image on. So for circular economy to play a bigger part in improving our industry, we really need to rapidly scale things up. We need to make reuse and retrofit the obvious choice, not the alternative one. And to do this, we need to convince as many stakeholders as possible. So that's clients, obviously, but financiers, insurance companies like Simon, developers, policymakers, resource managers, building users, investors, and also small businesses, because it will be that bottom-up engagement with the ideas around circular economy that will make things happen. So we need a whole toolbox of strategies and arguments. If we look at the bigger picture just for a moment, step back, we know that as an industry, we're the biggest consumers of raw materials and also the biggest producer of waste. So we've got a lot to rebalance. Extending the life of our building stock will really help to reduce both impacts, less extraction and less waste. But the impacts are wider than this, and the solutions are more than just optimizing material use. As engineers, we need to find the balance between dematerializing, but also minimizing risk and achieving good technical performance. So when you're talking to wider groups about the circular economy, it also helps to remember other impacts of material extraction and manufacture. We've seen that the raw materials market is becoming increasingly geopolitical. That volatility affects supply chains and ultimately creates additional risk for new build projects. Also, more resources go into manufacturing new materials than just carbon. Water is a precious resource in many parts of the world, and not least our own. So avoiding greater water use. Extraction also causes really quite direct and primary damage to the landscape, but secondary impacts of pollution to the air, our air, our water, and our soil. These can have long-term impacts on human health and natural systems. So every time we quantify with just carbon, we're not quantifying habitat loss or health impacts. And these are often really compelling arguments to different audiences when we're talking about circular economy. But there's also positive ways to talk about circular economy. We could be talking about material abundance instead of scarcity. Our buildings are full of great resources. We just need to quantify and value them. If we talk about them as assets, we can measure the value of maintaining them instead of looking at ways to downgrade. Because let's be clear, most forms of recycling are actually downcycling, and downgraded materials are often just future waste problems. So reducing construction waste is still a very strong argument, and particularly at the city scale. Policymakers in Paris have recognized this in their recent planning changes. So now developers need permission to demolish. It's not a given right. So this is largely because Paris is running out of places to put construction waste. All good arguments for circular economy. I've got just drawn down a hotspot diagram from a report by the Green Alliance, and it's so that we can maybe just think about some of the other metrics involved with measuring on circular economy scales. So, for example, did you know that box on the small box on the right-hand side there, that glass actually uses 3 liters of water to produce 1 kilogram of flat glass? So just highlighting other impacts. But if we're thinking about steel, production of steel, 85% of the extracted material actually becomes waste during the production stage. And much of that's with high levels of toxicity at the end. So I think really useful to remember that waste occurs at every stage of a product's life cycle, not just at the end of life. Avoiding demolition and extending the life of materials and components in a building addresses waste on so many levels. So it's our parallel challenge to think about end of life and look for creating a better market for secondhand materials. And that's another really important part of the circular economy. But how do we get our profession to switch over to more circular practices? This is the main part of my talk. What kind of strategies can we use? Well, I think we really have to talk about it more and at every stage of the design. Here I've just mapped, or a colleague has just mapped, the REBA stages of design from 0 to 5, and thinking about how we normally speak about lowering carbon on a project, building less, building light. But just recognizing that that early stage of 0 and 1, pre-brief setting, is really where the opportunity to talk about not building at all comes in. So if you're target setting, if you're setting your goals, it's really important to get a very early involvement in discussions to have any influence at all. At Expedition, our engineers work across our master planning and our innovation teams. Natasha mentioned some of the projects we've got ongoing with concrete. And these teams work with clients at very early stages in a project, or actually well in advance. And our experience, like many others I'm sure, is that unless circular solutions are targeted and specific, they will get derailed very quickly at the next stages. So once the targets are set, it doesn't end there. You really have to think about ways of implementing and planning for stages 2 to 6, and that's crucial. So thinking about setting up stage tracking and reporting on targets, but also exploring robust ways to embed them in procurement. When you're setting goals and setting strategies, 2 things that can make a big difference are having more data about the existing buildings, and also getting the architect or the client to articulate their wider goals. So I just want to look at some of these approaches in the next slide. We've already heard today that policies aren't really working for us at the moment, that regulations are on the way, but not quite there yet. While we're waiting for them, I think there's 2 really important documents available that are coming into wider usage. The Mayor of London's London Plan has set out these different ways of thinking about projects early on. So when you're applying for planning permission on a referred project, you need to establish the pre-demolition audit to highlight any issues around waste and potential for recycling. But you also have to provide a circular economy statement. Now, the circular economy statement is happening at just the right stage. It's crucially just gathering all the information you need from the different members of the design team and helping enable that conversation early on. In terms of pre-demolition audits, turning that conversation away from demolition and towards reuse and reclamation really needs the right expert input from a demolition contractor. At Expedition, we've been talking a lot to demolition contractors lately. We're learning all the time from them, learning about program constraints, learning about big cost items like cranes when you're aiming to reclaim as much as possible, and also about specific technical challenges for deconstruction. This is really important. These knowledge exchanges just between contractors and consultants is so crucial to finding new solutions. And we need to adapt business models as well to make this happen. So another way that we work fairly early on with clients is trying to pull out some of their ambitions. So the next strategy I want to talk about is how we use tools and create our own tools to help your client make those decisions. So we're really big fans at Expedition of whole life carbon reporting, but sometimes a more bespoke tool is needed. Some of our clients have really large estates and they're looking for longer term advice. So understanding that end goal and ways to get there are really important. It might be about decarbonising their estates. It might be about extending the life of their buildings. They just want more use from them. Or maybe planning in maintenance alongside upgrades. Here in this example, we've helped a local authority client look at alternatives to demolition and rebuild. So exploring whole life carbon cost for a number of different scenarios allowed the client to compare an embodied carbon, the embodied carbon involved in rebuild versus different levels of retrofit. They could explore phasing of the work and also look at how to stay operational during energy retrofit works. I've put a reference there to the Letty guidance. It's really very helpful in unpicking some of these stories. So we used whole life carbon tools to work with clients who have complex operational needs. They might be university estates or commercial landlords, but also infrastructure clients like rail and water, so really on a big scale. And using the tools, we can demonstrate the impact of circular thinking by taking a longer view and really exploring future strategies for managing assets. Our first question is always, is it possible to build nothing? So to answer your questioner there, Natasha. But everything gets interrogated once you start the conversation, whether that's about extending the life of assets or do elements need to be fully replaced or just worn out parts. Maybe it's about creating material hubs and internal systems to reuse stock items. But it might also be about consulting with external stakeholders, designers, project managers, suppliers, to really dig down into that detail. That's part of our construction innovation offering. But we like to explore methodologies of performance testing of materials in situ as well. And sometimes it can lead to pilots or demonstrators as an opportunity to test a market or to learn more. Recently, so many of these pilots actually lead to really interesting research, and at the same time, we get to expand our knowledge networks. So working with one very engaged client and a group of interested experts, we successfully bid for ICE funding to study regenerative practice models. We're really excited about this and looking forward to presenting the outcomes.
Kirsty, that's just 5 minutes on and 5 minutes to the end.
Yep, I've got two more slides. So now I've just got a couple of really quick case studies looking at that project implementation stage, so looking later in the project. Here, an example of a target-driven client, this housing development project, we were asked to advise the client on sustainable target setting. This involved, again, whole life carbon studies to benchmark the design and setting some really challenging but realistic targets. Once we had those, we could support the design team to check solutions that met these targets, which included low carbon designs, different approaches, but also secondhand materials, including steel and bricks. So setting those in the context of a carbon budget for a project is really useful. So when we were checking on the benchmark progress against the benchmark, we were able to identify when some of the design specifications were going over budget. So for example, the facade element is showing here as being outside of our target range. And that gave us an opportunity to revisit and look at different range screen options and set them against the original ideas of the secondhand bricks as an outcome. So once you've got your targets, you need to make sure that you're tracking and identifying, as you can see, but also finding ways to embed those targets into the procurement strategy. In this case, it was set as a whole building carbon performance target with clear advice on how the carbon targets could be most easily met. And within that, the case for circular materials is clearly made, but the contractor and their design teams have flexibility to carbon save in other areas. So one last slide, a lovely project that's pushing for complete circularity. At the moment, we're somewhere around REBA stage 3, and the client, Global Generation, they're an educational charity based in King's Cross, and they build community gardens. This will be their fifth site that they've developed. And although the projects are fairly modest in scale, the educational value is so much bigger. Because they're working with communities, but they're also working with industry and reaching out to them for the materials, but also as a way to educate within wider industry. So they reach a really wide audience. It's great. So we're partway through the design process, and we're already getting surplus materials from sites across King's Cross. There's clay arisings that are being made into handmade bricks before being fired at brickmakers H.T. Matthews. And there's storm-felled trees that are being turned into timber shingles. Decisions around the final structural elements are going to depend on what materials turn up. So that's a bit of a challenge. Our design needs to be flexible enough to accommodate different size windows, maybe, but also open to alternative structural materials. So to help the procurement team, we're developing a set of rules to follow. We're also managing to activate some informal materials exchanges through our own network of clients and sites. That's all I wanted to talk about in terms of case studies. I've put together some resources, so I'll just offer them up to you, some really useful iStruct ones and some of the materials that I've used to prepare my talk today. Thank you so much for listening.